Is real estate the best path to financial independence? As a diehard index fund investor, I used to have a clear answer. But after researching Chad Carson's small but mighty real estate philosophy, I'm starting to see the potential. While I still prefer the hands off nature of index funds, especially as I focus on growing my income, I can see real estate playing a role in my future. It offers steady cash flow, diversification, and even scratches my entrepreneurial itch. And when that time comes, I'll be turning to Chad Carson's content. With 2 years of real estate investing experience, Chad knows how to find, analyze, and buy solid investment properties. In this episode, Chad breaks down the fundamentals of real estate investing, including how to find quality deals in a high-priced market, red flags to watch out for, and key financial metrics to evaluate before buying. I learned a ton from this conversation, and I'm already looking forward to a part 2. I hope you enjoy my conversation with the former college football player turned small and mighty real estate investor, Chad Carson. You know those moments where you think, I wish I would have learned this in school? Those are the topics that we love to talk about. Join me each week as I interview experts sharing their strategies for solving problems that us young adults will face throughout our 20s and 30s. So what are you waiting for? If you want new episodes about adulting advice every Monday, hit that follow button. Well, Chad, I'm super stoked to have you on the podcast. We're covering a topic that probably should have a little bit more airtime on the podcast, but never seems to really find its way into my content calendar, and that's real estate. And I think part of that is probably because I just haven't surrounded myself with the right people that I feel like I would align with if I was a real estate investor. But then I stumbled upon you. We met at a FinCon last year. We went on a run together, and I thought your approach to real estate was really refreshing and a little bit different than a lot of what I see and hear on social media and other podcasts. So Chad, I'm really excited to pick your brain a little bit more on today's conversation and really talk about how you invest in real estate.
Oh, my pleasure. Great to be here. And I enjoyed that run. I'm chasing you in that run. That was like, you kind of came down to my level. That was very nice of you.
Well, Chad, let's start with what real estate does for you as an investment. I know you're also an index fund investor. So I would like to kind of understand what the job real estate does for you in your portfolio and some maybe of the pros and the cons of real estate investing.
Yeah, I like nerding out on comparing different investments. And I like index fund investing, broadly investing in equities, and I like real estate. I read a study one time, it was the return on everything, I think was the name of it. If anybody Googles that, it was I think it was a Harvard team who did this, but they basically looked over the last 150 years or so. And it was a really interesting study because they looked at the sources of your returns, like where do the returns come from and how much were they? The long and short of it was, on a global scale, real estate and equities were almost the same. Like when you broke it down, I think the number was like 9% historically, or 8, whatever the number was. It was very similar. In the US over the last 60 years or so, equities have had a little bit of an advantage over that. But what I found really interesting when you looked at real estate was, if you break down how you make money in real estate, there's 2 main sources. Number one, you make money from the rent of the property. So if you collect rent and you pay all your expenses, there's hopefully something left over. And just assume, for example, you don't even use a mortgage, because when you use a mortgage or debt, it kind of complicates it a little bit. It's a good thing, but it also complicates it. But if you bought a property and you rented it and you had $5,000 left over every year, that would be one source of return. And then the other source of return is the growth of the property. So both the growth of the rent, because the rent tends to go up every year as salaries go up and the economy goes up, and then the price of the property itself tends to go up. And I think if you just remember those 2 metrics, the income and the growth, it really explains a lot in real estate as I unpack everything else. And it's not much different than equities. When I evaluate equities, I'm not an individual stock investor, but when I look at the S&P 500 or the total stock market index, I ask myself, how is it that this return is going to be good for me over the long run? And I look at the earnings of the entire stock market. And typically it's like 4 or 5% of the value of the stock that you buy is the rate of earnings. And so the bet you're making is, you're saying, all right, well, I'm making about 4 or 5%, maybe a little bit of that's a dividend, but they retain a lot of those earnings. But then that stock, the earnings are going to grow over time. And if I want to make a 9% return and I'm making like a 4 or 5% rate from the earnings, it's got to grow about 4 or 5% per year. real estate is very similar to that. Like, in fact, some of the numbers in many markets are almost exactly the same as that. So I think if you know stocks and you understand the fundamentals of equity investing, real estate has its differences, but at its essence, it's an investment that can produce income and it can produce growth. But I think one of the main benefits of real estate two main benefits of real estate that I like better than stocks. One is you can use your entrepreneurial skills to affect your return. You can actually do better than the market. And that's not possible. Like when you buy index funds, you're just saying, I want to be the market. I don't want to beat the market. In fact, it's very hard and probably impossible for most of us to beat the market. Whereas real estate is very likely. If you learn a few skills, you could buy a property 10% below its full value because somebody was really motivated to sell. You could buy a property 20 or 30% below its value if you get really good at fixing up properties or building new construction. You can manage your property better than your neighbor manages it. You can treat your tenants really well and they stay longer. So there's just a long list of things that you can do that don't require a ton of skill, or it's not like a rocket science, but you can actually get a better return than the average. So I really like that about real estate. And then number two, and I'll stop talking about it, is I also like that there's a little bit less volatility. It's just a pretty steady income. Like the stock market's great, but man, you got to go through some roller coasters of ups and downs. Whereas real estate, I think one of the main benefits of real estate is actually the thing people who don't like real estate say is a negative, is that it's not liquid. You can't sell it. And that's actually a good thing, because in 2008, 9, and 10, when everybody wanted to sell real estate, you were down 30% or 40%. And you didn't want to lose money. So you're like, well, I guess I won't sell it. Nobody's buying. And so you keep it, which forces you to have a long-term perspective with real estate. And I think that built-in, quote, disadvantage is actually one of the biggest advantages. Is why the best way to make money in real estate is just to hold it and not sell it. And so that's been really good for me, is that you just do this boring buy and hold strategy and you end up making a lot more money.
Yeah, I think that was really well said. And I like the parallel that you're painting here between equities and real estate, especially if you're a long-term buy and hold index fund investor. Real estate, or at least the approach that you're presenting with real estate, might pair or even marry really well with that strategy. And we have a lot of people that are pursuing financial independence, and they're typically like grinding at W-2 jobs. Maybe they're side hustling or growing a business. But as they reduce some of the time or the effort that goes into those jobs, I think real estate might be an opportunity for them to add a little bit of that stability that you were talking about to their portfolio, because they will want to start drawing down on that portfolio eventually. And I just think whenever you got $5,000 coming in a year on a piece of real estate, and maybe that gives you a little bit of balance, because we're not going to see the same kind of shift to your equities portfolio. Like you could very easily have a 20 or 30% drop in equities. You might get your 1 or 2% dividend out of the index fund every single year, but you're probably not going to see a 20 or 30% drop in your piece of property. And you're definitely probably not going to see that same kind of drop in rent.
That's the key. Yeah. I mean, I've studied, like, if you look at the Great Depression, real estate went down in value. I remember my grandmother used to tell me, like, your great uncle lost his land in the real estate, and he had a mortgage for 50%, and he still lost the property because it went down like 60% or 70% during the Great Recession. So, I mean, the depression. So it can go down. It will go down. But if you look at, even when properties went down in value during the Great Depression, the worst economy we've had in modern era, the rents actually went down like 20% or 25%. That's really telling to me. Like during a time when people, especially residential real estate, like I'm not talking about commercial with businesses, that's a whole another animal, which I don't really play in. It can have its advantages too. But residential real estate, if you're in a good location where people have jobs and people want to live, people need a place to live. And if you have to, you can reduce the rent and get it filled up. And it's, historically speaking, at least, it hasn't been like a 70% haircut. It's been like, during the Great Recession, I had to drop rents like 5%, 10% just to keep a good tenant. But you can survive that. Like you're not gonna and so the prices might go down, but the rent tends to be very stable, and it tends to keep up with the salaries of whatever the market you're in.
And once again, I love that first point you made too around entrepreneurship and you actually being able to maybe impact the return that you're getting from something like that. So let's start shifting into that conversation a little bit. We definitely won't be able to cover it all in today's conversation. I really want to focus probably on finding great deals and evaluating those properties. And then if we need a part two, that you already agreed that
happy to do it.
you can come back on a part two. Yeah. So let's talk finding deals. In a market right now where I feel like things feel very high priced, interest rates are at a higher rate, although we could probably make a counter argument that they're not really historically that high. And there's definitely limited supply. How do you go about, or how do you coach some of your clients going about finding quality deals?
The supply is very low historically. I think that's one of the weirder things about this market, at least when we're talking in 2025, is it is the amount of properties on the market because of a couple of reasons. One, but primarily because people have existing interest rates that are really low. And so a lot of people who already own homes are like, I don't want to sell my property at 3% interest and have to go get a 7% or 6% interest rate. So this lock-in effect has really reduced the inventory of properties. That's what we're facing. So if you want to find good deals as an investor, there's two recommendations I'll have. One is you need to do your homework ahead of time before you even go look for it. And there's this idea of developing a buy box is what I really like to teach. And the way I compare it to, like, when you buy a new car or you get a new outfit or something new, like before that, you might have never noticed that this silver Prius was out there. But now that you own a silver Prius, it's like they're everywhere. Like you start noticing them everywhere. And so the way I've studied it is there's a part of your brain called the reticular activating system where you basically, your brain is like a filtering mechanism. But if you put in that filter, this is what I'm looking for, all of a sudden you'll start recognizing it everywhere. And so it's the same way with real estate. If you develop this buy box, which is basically a filtering mechanism where you say, out of the thousands and thousands of properties in my market, I just want to focus on this zip code or this neighborhood. And within that neighborhood, I want to focus on single family houses that are 3-bedroom, 2-bath, 1,200 to 1,800 square feet that are built after year 2000. That's an example of how detailed you would probably get with a buy box. And there is an art and a science to developing that buy box, but you can model other people, you can copy other people. Like I have a couple YouTube videos on building your buy box and you can get a pretty good grasp of it. But the point would be you're focusing and you're not just saying, I'll take any deal in the Atlanta market. Like that's ridiculously big. There's 6 to 8 million people in Atlanta. You can't cover that entire territory. As a new investor, you really want to start very, very small in scope. In fact, I recommend one of my favorite, I might be getting off track here a little bit, but when you're first starting in investing, buy something that is similar to what you would want to live in, or even buy something that you do live in, where you actually move into a property. And we call that house hacking in the real estate world, where you either live in like a house that has an ADU, which is like a backyard guest house essentially, or you turn your basement into something you could rent, or your garage, or you buy a duplex and live in one side of the duplex and rent the other side. Or I've seen people who are fresh out of college and they don't have, they're just on their own. They might rent out bedrooms at a 3-bedroom house. There's a lot of creative ways to basically turn your home into an investment. And so finding the deal is a little bit less burdensome then. You're like, okay, I'm going to find a place that I would like to live. I want to find a place that I can afford to live. And that if I rent the property out, it'll actually help me pay the mortgage payment. And it doesn't have to be like a home run real estate deal. Like I've seen people, their mortgage payment on the house might have been $2,000, including their taxes and insurance and everything else. And they rented out 2 bedrooms and got $700 a piece or $750 a piece. That's $1,500. They're now living for $500 when it would have cost them $2,000.
Yeah.
That's a win. Like that's really incredible because as a young investor, you can now save that $1,500 every month and invest that in the stock market or invest in something else, right? So I think real estate as your residence and thinking about your residence a little bit differently, especially early in your career, is probably the best way. If you're willing to do that, either renting out your home or just living in a home that eventually could become a rental. Like even if you don't rent out the bedrooms, just buy a simple house. Don't buy like the biggest house on the block. Don't buy a 3,000 square foot mansion kind of thing. Like just buy something simple that would be a nice rental and then keep it instead of selling it after you move out and outgrow it. Keep it as a rental and then kind of transition from there.
Let me bring you back to your buy box too, because I found that really interesting. So you gave some criteria: zip code, the number of bedrooms, bathrooms, the square footage of the house. All in my head are like Zillow type filter criteria.
100%.
But I've also heard you mention there are a few other factors, like in your buy box specifically, like walkability. Are there things that you think about from that front? And maybe that's more of an advanced investor thought process, but would you suggest that your buy box includes some other things outside of, like I said, the Zillow criteria filters?
Yeah, I would. I think this is sort of like the cool thing about real estate is that a lot of it's intuitive. So think about like what you like living in. Where do you like to live? And then ask yourself, are there other people like me? Are there other people who like it? So for me, I am a big walkability component. Like I actually spend a lot of my time with a nonprofit here in Clemson, South Carolina that some friends and I helped found, where we're trying to build a network of walking and biking trails that would connect all the towns in our area and the Clemson University. It's a whole other story, but it's a very difficult uphill battle. But what I found is it's so difficult to create communities that are walkable and locations that are walkable that if you invest in those, economics, the more limited a commodity is, the lower the supply, the more valuable it is. So I think there's a big scope of people who love living in places where they can walk to the local park, they can walk to the coffee shop. It's just walkability has been Zillow actually had a book that they showed that walkability is very closely correlated with increased appreciation on properties, like above average appreciation. So that I sort of formed my own strategy there. And I think anybody can do this. Even if you're not into walkability, you might say, well, I like living in the country and I like having 3 acres, and there's probably an investment for that too. There's probably people who want that.
Yep.
But there's a big group of people who want these walkable spaces. So I've developed this little strategy that might be helpful for people, that if you think about every city where you invest, like the solar system, the center of your solar system, the sun, is like the energy that feeds everything else. Like, the earth would be a freezing ice ball if it didn't have the sun. And so like you look at cities like Atlanta, Georgia is a good example because I grew up there. Atlanta is the hot economic sun. It's one of the biggest economic markets in the country. It's got lots of S&P 500 companies, lots and lots of people. And so you can try to invest in the sun, but the prices are pretty high in the center of the city, like Buckhead, Atlanta, all these places are really, really expensive. But if you go in the satellite cities, like the little planets outside of Atlanta, so I grew up in Noonan, Georgia. There's also, I went to school in College Park. So these are areas that are 15 minutes, 30 minutes outside the city. And I like finding places like that have their own gravity, their own character, their own walkability. So I like to find suburban cities near a great economic sun that have walkability and livability, but are still relatively affordable. And so like Noonan, Georgia, where I grew up, it's a pretty good example of that. It has a little court square with old buildings, has cool little bars. You could find a house relatively close to the downtown area, or a condo or a townhouse that are still relatively affordable. That's a theory. People could feel free to steal that one. Like, go find your own satellite city in an area. I find those have less competition than the big investors and the big, huge institutional people trying to buy it. As a small and mighty investor, which I kind of subscribe to, if you're just trying to buy a few properties, like go to a satellite city, incorporate that into your buy box. That's how you'll decide to invest in a certain zip code or a certain neighborhood, is because of that theory of like finding the economic sun, but also just like, do you like it? Like, is it a cool place to be? Is it a cool place to live? What kind of vibe does it have? Like, you can actually use your emotions in real estate. That's okay. In fact, that's a good thing, because your renter and your buyer will also use their emotions to pick a location. It's a very emotional thing to pick your home. And so if you can wear 2 hats, wear your emotional, find your location hat, and then also put on your numbers hat to say it still has to be affordable. Like, there has to be a rent to price ratio, and we could talk about numbers that still make sense. But it's really, real estate is like a Venn diagram of those 2 things: the emotional appeal of a location, and then the economic viability and kind of a location as well.
Yeah, I love this illustration around the economic sun and the kind of the satellite, I think you call it suburbans, suburban, urban. And that was really relieving whenever I was researching you, whenever you were talking about this concept, because like, I would love to buy here in Austin, Texas, but it is becoming so expensive in this city. But I have been recognizing that some of my friends that are in real estate are targeting some of these other cities that are just right outside of Austin. There's Pflugerville or Round Rock, which are 2 very popular suburbs that are popping up, and they're 20 to 30 minutes outside of Austin. And they have a lot of the things that you're mentioning. Both have like little historic town squares that can kind of function on their own. But if you want to go watch a show or catch a game, you can still drive into the city at a pretty easy rate. And if you need a job, like, you're anchored pretty close to a really healthy economic city, or even maybe potentially some economic activity that's happening in your own city and suburb. So I loved that. And I thought it was a really good strategy if somebody's just getting started and they feel like they're in an area currently where they probably wouldn't invest in because the capital up front is just too much because of what it is, or it's just not what they want in terms of their long-term homes either.
Exactly. Yeah.
How do you go about like finding these properties? Do you always initiate a relationship with a real estate agent right away? Do you do off-market deals? What would your approach be? And I guess maybe stepping back, what would you suggest an approach for a first-time real estate investor?
I would say once you have the buy box, that was a long-winded kind of segue there to say like buy box is most important because then you know what you're looking for. Like, so don't go get a real estate agent and just say, hey, real estate agent, find me a great place. Like your real estate agent will appreciate you and you'll find the good agents if you have your buy box ahead of time. And they can help you develop it a little bit, but you can use Zillow and other things to develop the buy box. But then I do recommend starting with a real estate agent, especially if you're new. I think that to the degree that you're comfortable buying properties on your own, you don't have to go through a real estate agent. But I think it's helpful because they understand the market. A good one will understand the dynamics of what's available out there, what's not. And if you tell them your buy box, you're like, hey, 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, this size. I think I want to buy it in this price range, 300 to 400,000 is kind of the range I have, the top of my budget, the bottom of my budget. I think I could rent it for this much if I ever move out of it. Tell them your assumptions and they might correct you a little bit. They might, oh, well, I don't know about that. Given that, let's go to this other place because that you're not going to be able to find it in that town. So a good agent will have that kind of market. And that's really what you're looking for. I mean, they'll also help you out with contracts and filling out a contract, but I find that to be the least is overrated compared to their market knowledge. And so if you're new to a market, if you're new to the transaction process, to me, it's well worth having that person help you out. So I always point people, number one, using a real estate agent and having them represent you. That's one way to do it. You can also play the game of just like with Zillow and aggregators out there now, you could just look at properties on your own and then contact the real estate agent who's listing the property. That's another way to do it. And there's different terms for this. Sometimes they call it dual agency, which is less common now, but you could just I'm a little bit more confident because I've done some transactions. I would just tell the listing agent, hey, we'll negotiate. You keep the commission. I just want to buy through you. I'm not, you don't have to represent me, but I just want to go directly through you. That's another way to do it these days. For a little bit, kind of a 201 level, if you're a little bit more confident, you know how to fill out contracts, you're a little bit more, so that may be that second, third, fourth transaction down the line. And then the other way I recommend is something called driving for dollars if you're local or walking for dollars or biking for dollars, whatever you want to do. Once you have a buy box, go to the neighborhoods where you want to buy. And this is, especially when it's really competitive, this is probably your best strategy. The listings on Zillow and the MLS are just really low right now. So you might not find exactly what you're looking for. So I like to go to the locations where I'm looking and just drive around. And what you're looking for is a couple things. You might look for sale by owner signs. That'd be nice. You could also look for rent by owner signs. Even if it's for rent, you could call them up and say, hey, I'm looking to buy a property. Would you be willing to sell this property? So that's another option. You're also looking for vacant or fixer-upper proprietors. So if it's like nice house. Ooh, that one has a 50-year-old roof that's falling off and the gutters have trees growing out of them. That would be a perfect candidate. And what do you do at that point? You can send them a letter. Most of the public records have contact information for owners. If you want to go a little bit higher level and spend some money on it, I have an app that I use called Deal Machine. And as you're driving around, you could just click on the property right there, and you can even set up where it just sends them a postcard or a letter that you've already done ahead of time. And you just bam, 3 seconds later, you send them a note. Or they give you the phone number of the owner, and you can just call the owner while you're sitting there and say, if you're willing to do this, it's a little bit uncomfortable, but you could call them up and say, hey, my name is Chad. It's kind of out of the blue, but I'm sitting out in front of a house at Maple Street, and I'm looking for a house to buy in that neighborhood. And I noticed your property at 123 Maple Street. Is that something you would consider selling? There you go. They might say no. They might say, no, never, I'm not selling. But you'll find properties sometimes that nobody else knows about, and you reach out to them. But it all starts with that buy box. Like if you try to go to the whole city, that strategy wouldn't really work. But if you're strategically driving these areas or walking them, number one, you get a good feel for the area, that you really get to know it. And number two, you find these little hidden gems that people don't know about. And if you send out 10, 20 letters or call 10 or 20 owners, you'll find a deal. Like I tell this people, I've been telling people this for years, and very few people do that. But if it's just a matter of numbers, like if you call 10, 20, 30 people, it's just, you're going to get a deal. You're going to find one. But if you sit there on the computer waiting for Zillow deals to fall in your lap, it's going to be pretty difficult, especially in a market like what we're in right now.
I love that. I think it's a great strategy. At minimum, it gets you familiar with the area that you're looking to purchase in and what the type of homes are. You might start striking through some streets like, oh, I don't like that street. Yep. There's something weird or wonky about that. I'm going to just mark that off. So whenever I'm looking on Zillow, anything on that street is just a no-go. Or maybe you find a highway runs through part of the neighborhood or the zip code. And now you're thinking, okay, everything west of this, not east of this is off limits. I like that. And I'm guessing you're going to probably have to take a few shots at multiple offers in order for you to actually get a deal on something too. So this gives you some reps and some opportunities in that.
You need to have that mentality that you're not going to always get the first deal. That is really, I've seen so many new investors get thrown off by that. And I've coached a lot of new investors through buying the first deal. And very commonly it's like 7 offers, 10 offers, 15 offers, like especially in a competitive market. So if you just get your mindset ahead of time that this is a little bit of a numbers game, and it's difficult because real estate emotional that we talked about earlier, it's emotionally taxing to get your hopes up. Oh, I love that property. And then somebody else got it. But this is where you have to kind of keep your detached hat on a little bit when you're buying an investment property. Like if you just trust the process, it'll come. You'll find the good deal. You'll find the right property. But this is a long game. You're going to buy multiple properties, so perhaps. And so don't get too attached to the first one. The number one rule of negotiating is don't get attached. Do not let your emotions tell you that you should, I got to have this property, when really just stick to your numbers, stick to your goals. And then there's always another deal, always another deal. You can just go to the next one.
That's great. So we talked a lot about finding a great deal, and we started with the first step, which is creating your buy box. That's the criteria that really limits and allows you to hyper-focus on a specific type and area. If you're not sure about the area, then I like this economic sun and satellite suburban concept that you gave out there, and you can kind of anchor to that and maybe find a hidden gem through there. And of course, the walking or the driving for dollars is a great way to familiarize yourself with areas and potentially find hidden gems that are off market and get you some more reps. Now let's assume that you have found a property and you're wanting to evaluate if this property is a good deal or not. We're going to talk about some ways to actually analyze the deal from a numbers and a metric standpoint. But first, just in general, talking about evaluating the property, are there any big red flags to watch out for whenever you're buying a investment property? Like, I know one thing in particular that you are always careful of is septic tanks, and like pretty much trying to get out of all septic tanks in your portfolio now.
Right.
Anything else in that vein that you're like, guys, just take it from me, don't do this?
Yeah. Well, the reason I don't like septics, I do have properties still with septics, but they're a long-term maintenance issue. Like, you would rather be on a sewer because the city maintains the sewer. You do have to maintain your sewer line underneath the house. So that'll be I have a long list of red flags, but anything having to do with water coming in or water going out of the property is often your most trickiest, most costly thing. So if you follow the water, actually, I think that might be a simple way to explain it, then you want to avoid water problems. So one of the big issues these days is hurricanes and floods like that. So if you're in an area that's more prone to hurricanes and floods, you need to be ultra careful about the elevation of your property. Like, are you buying in a floodplain? Are you buying near a floodplain? If your property is 30 feet away from a floodplain, it might move your direction. Like next year you might be in the floodplain. So that's something to be really careful about. There is insurance out there in certain cases for buying in floodplains, but will it be there 5 years from now? I don't know. Like, it's just another thing. So I like to buy properties that are high and dry if I can. I have a mentor in Sarasota, Florida, which just got hit by a hurricane last year, named John Schaub. And I asked him about that right after the hurricane. I was like, have you always been careful about that in Florida? He's like, of course. Like, this has been like since I was a kid. My dad, we grew up in Miami. He's like, I always buy properties in neighborhoods that have a little bit more of an elevation, properties with lots that are a little bit higher than the road, for example. If you're looking on Google Earth and you're just following it, if you're on the road and the house is below the road, like by 5-6 feet, that's a problem in many cases. It's not, I own some properties like that. If everything else is great, but it's a problem because gravity or water goes downhill with gravity, and it's going to run into your property. And yes, there's ways to solve that. You can dig drains in front of the house and French drains, and you can put sump pumps under the house, but real estate's really a game of maintenance, and you want to reduce all the extra maintenance you can. You want it to be as lean as possible. My best properties are the ones that are brick or some kind of exterior surface that I don't have to paint, and I don't have like zero painting on the outside. And then inside, it would be hardwood floors, like some kind of wood floor or a tile or a luxury vinyl plank, not carpet in the bedroom, perhaps just for comfort. But like all of this is like very maintenance driven. And so the big red flags you want to watch are, what are the long-term maintenance issues of this property? Water being a really big one, both from the elevation of the property, but also you want to look at plumbing systems. If you buy a 1940s or 50s property, the plumbing is probably it has a lifespan, like 60, 70 years, and they have these old galvanized pipes. So I would just say The newer property you can buy if you're a brand new investor, the better. So something 20, 30 years ago. I love old properties. I'm a sucker for old properties. I just think they're really cool, but you're asking for pain when you buy old properties.
Yeah.
So, if you want to go like vanilla, especially these index fund investor, if you're like, I just want to be kind of hands off here, buy newer properties, turnkey properties, buy them in areas where there's no water issues. And then if you do that, there's some other gotchas, but those are the big ones.
Makes sense. And now let's talk about the number side to things. Earlier you mentioned the rent to price ratio as a metric to look for. Is that something that you run or calculate? And then I guess maybe even taking a step back from that, what are some of the other key financial metrics to understand before you start making offers?
Yeah. So remember we talked about the core value of real estate is it produces income and it grows in value. And so the income is actually, as I evaluated my properties over the last 21 years, I've made a lot more money because I use leverage. I've made a lot more money with the growth of the property than I have with the cash flow. It's ironic because a lot of people chase cash flow, but I think the strategy I like to use is sort of a hybrid between cash flow and growth. And so what's the most important metric? You do want to, even though growth is going to be number one, that's why we invest in those satellite cities of big economic zones, because that's going to tend, if population growth happens, and if in a normal market, the price of your property is going to tend to go up. That's just sort of a pretty close correlation. So that's why we even did all that stuff of the location and the buy box. But you also want to buy affordability. So if I went into a town that was in a great location, a satellite city, and this is amazing, but I bought a property for $700,000 and the rent was $2,000, that's not going to work. And why is it not going to work? That's actually pretty common in California and some other places. So let's talk about why that wouldn't work. If you rent the property for $2,000, let's just ignore the mortgage for the moment. Let's just say I paid cash, $700,000 in cash. If I rent it for $2,000, probably half of my rent is gone in expenses. So that's just a rough rule of thumb. They call that the 50% rule. It's not always exactly right. Sometimes it's 40%, sometimes it's 55%. But if you're just doing like really rough back of the envelope math, you can say, all right, half of the rent gone from expenses. And what is that? That's taxes, insurance, maintenance, vacancy, maybe paying a property manager. So in that example, 2,000 minus 1,000 means you have $1,000 left over every single month. And then times 12, that's $12,000 per year. And I don't have my calculator in front of me there, right? But like $12,000 divided by 700,000 is a really pretty low number. That's a very low, we call that like a cap rate or a yield, a rental yield. And really what you're looking for, so going back to your metrics question, the most important metric I like to look at is the yield of a property. These days, I'm trying to have a yield of like 5 to 6%, somewhere in there for a quality property. I've seen some markets, like higher growth markets maybe, where you're like 4%, 4.5% is more typical. But what is that? That's just saying whatever the rent is on the property, subtracting all my operating expenses except for my mortgage, I'm ignoring my mortgage for the moment, what would my ratio of that net rent, that's called net operating income, be compared to what I would pay for the property? That metric is really important. How do you get there? You can do a rough rule of thumb like that. That's ultimately what I'm trying to figure out. But the rent to price ratio is sort of a proxy for that. So if you look at a market and you say, all right, the rent is $2,000 and the price is $700,000, that's a pretty low ratio. On the other end of the spectrum, if you went to some parts of Indiana or Michigan or South Carolina, some like lower price markets, you might find a property where the rent is 1% of the value that you pay for the property. So let me give you an example. Maybe I could buy a property for $100,000 that rents for $1,000. So what that other market, $2,000, $700,000. This lower price market, a $1,000 rent, you pay $100,000. That's an old rule of thumb that people used to call the 1% rule. And that just means that if you could buy a property where the rent is 1% of what you paid for it, there's a good chance you'll make a positive cash flow. That's the reason you would say that. That translates to like a 6 or 7% unleveraged yield or cap rate. So if you can get a 1% rule, it's like, let's call it 6 or 7. So these days, like I think that the numbers, especially in a quality location, it'd be more difficult to buy a 1% rule. Not impossible. I have some apartments and things that I've bought that still do pretty well like that. But if you're buying a single family house or a duplex in a good location in that satellite city that I'm talking about, a rent to price ratio of maybe like 0.67 would be more like what I'm seeing from students and people who are buying out there right now. That kind of gives you a good combination of enough cash flow with the price appreciation of the property to still make things make sense. But what people need to realize right now is if you're going to buy a pure investment today, you're going to have to probably put more money down. It's not going to be like 5% down and the thing cash flows like it did when you had 4% interest rates. I've seen people put 30, 40% down on an investment property that's a $300,000 or $400,000 property. That is a typical cost of entry for the pure investment property. The only exception being the house hack that we talked about earlier. So if you can move into the property and get like a 5 or 10% down loan because you're living in the property, you might be able to kind of sneak in. And that's one of the great starter strategies is you get in for lower money down, you're living there for a while, so you don't have to have quite the cash flow that you would in a pure investment property. And then as rents grow over time, then you can still make it a good investment property.
Yeah, you're slowly convincing me that the house hacking is probably a great strategy for first-time real estate investors, especially if you're going to be living in it and you already have some built-in roommates that are coming in that are going to help kind of pave the way for your mortgage those first few years. And then I know there are some tax advantages if you stay in the property for an extended amount of time. And of course, what you just mentioned from a mortgage standpoint, another great thing if you don't quite have the capital to put 30 to 40% down.
Yes, exactly. House hacking's got a lot of benefits. And I know it's not for everybody, but hey, I always try to convince people to at least consider that. And especially if you're in a high price market. So if I were in Austin, if I were in the Bay Area of California, if I were in New York, house hacking would be my first strategy. If I want to invest locally, if you want to, there's an idea. Some people they just say, well, I'm just going to invest in another part of the country, and that could work too. You could just take your $200,000 that you were going to put as a down payment in San Francisco, and just go buy a $200,000 property somewhere else and just pay cash, or put $100,000 down on a $300,000 property in 2 or 3 different houses. So both of those are viable. But that, going long distance is another business model. So I think if you haven't bought your first property yet, that could be a little intimidating to do that.
Yeah, you don't have the security of being there to go and check out the property very easily. Of course, you don't know the area as well, or you might not stay on top of what's happening in the area if you're not immersed in it on a day-to-day basis. Yeah. As we're wrapping up this conversation, Chad, I really want to talk about the philosophy that you take with real estate investing. And this is this concept that you call the small and mighty real estate investor. I think this is really important. Of course, we did kind of the carrot and the stick situation with this episode where we shared a bunch of the nuts and bolts to actually get into real estate investing. But I think the real first step that you should be taking is matching real estate with your life goals and really understanding why you are getting into real estate investing. So I'd love it if you picked it up from there and kind of talked about your concept around the small and mighty investor.
Yeah, so a lot of the real estate circles, if you've ever watched any YouTube about real estate, there's just a trend that a lot of people say, go big, you need to 10x everything and you need to own 1,000 units. And it's sort of a rah-rah kind of game that people play. And I try to take the opposite of that. I like to say that most investors, in fact, most successful investors I know who have the most peace of mind, the most flexibility, the most success, I would say, from a life standpoint, have a very small portfolio or smaller than that. They don't have 1,000 units. They're doing this part-time and they might own 5 properties, 10 properties, 20, 30 properties. Like that might feel big if you're brand new, but you don't have to be this enormous business. In fact, the vast majority of real estate investors own these small portfolios. I call those small and mighty portfolios because it actually works out better in the end. And I'll paint a picture real quick just with the kind of basic math is that you could find, let's say you bought over the next 10 years, you bought 1 property per year, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 10 years from now, you end up with properties. They've gone up in value. You got mortgages on all 10 of those properties. And then you start pruning their portfolio, I call it, where you start selling off a few of those. Maybe some of them have septic tanks. You want to get rid of those, or maybe whatever reason they're not as good at rentals. But you decide to sell off 3, 4, 5 properties, and you take your profits from those properties. You pay taxes on them, and you use those profits to pay off the debt on the 5 properties you have left. Now, this is just one example. There's lots of ways to do this. But let's just imagine that those 5 properties each have $2,000 a month in rent, and you've paid your debt off. And so remember that rule, 50% rule we said earlier. So if they rented for $2,000, you had about $1,000 left over on 5 properties. So that's $5,000 per month or $60,000 per year. You can have this small little portfolio of properties that you developed over a 10-year period. And now you're making $60,000 per year, inflation adjusted, because the rents tend to go up over time with inflation for the rest of your life. I find that if you want to make $120,000, just do 10 properties instead of 5. I find that idea so compelling because most people think, well, I have to have 100 properties to have $100,000 per year. And my point is, no, you can have a small number of properties, especially if you do it in a simple way, in a small and mighty way. And that's actually the better way from a time standpoint, because ultimately what I want to be is a time billionaire. I don't want to be a billionaire on money. I don't need $1 billion. I need enough money to do whatever I want to do. I want to be financially independent. And then I need a bunch of time to be a parent and be present with my kids. And I need time to go travel. I need time to do these volunteer activities in my community that make a big difference to me. And so if you want to have time and be a time billionaire, then you need to build a business model, a real estate investing model that makes sense to do that. And so real estate, yes, it is not a completely passive business, but it is passive enough. I've lived in Spain, I've lived in Ecuador while we had real estate. And on average, once I get my portfolio stabilized, it was a couple hours a week for me. And I have a lot of people, I've asked this question to, students and audience members of mine. And when they have like a 5 or 10 property portfolio and it's stable like that, it's like 3 or 4 hours a month. So it's passive enough. It's passive enough. It makes money, and it's a little small part-time job, and it has income that can produce freedom for you for a very, very long time.
And the nice thing is, if you're coast-fi or even financially independent at that point in time too, you might be able to pick and choose the hours that you want to put into your real estate business. Like maybe you do enjoy fixing things at your properties. So, when a tenant calls and you want to go handle a repair, you handle a repair. Maybe you don't, and you just contract that out, and maybe you're not doing as well from an expense side, but it's all covered, and that's fine. Maybe you want to manage your own properties. Maybe you want to find a deal or two, but you can essentially sit back and wait for the perfect right deal. Your buy box can get even smaller and smaller because you're much less dependent, and you don't also have this like huge portfolio that's carrying so much weight on you from a day-to-day basis just because you wanted to put up 100 or 200 or 300 doors because someone on YouTube told you should do that.
Yeah, exactly. And there's also a quality level. Our mutual friend, Joel, in Atlanta, I love his portfolio. They have a podcast, How to Money, by the way, which is really, really good. He and Matt. But they have small portfolios, and I feel like they're craftsmen. Like they focus on the quality. They focus on the quality of the relationship with their tenant. They focus on treating their property well and keeping it maintained. And I find that craftsmanship is such a undervalued piece of real estate. I'm speaking personally, one of the things I got to get better at is as I expanded over the years, I find there's just extra things that are taking my attention, and I'm not doing as good a job of taking care of the craft of my business. So I think that's a really neat, unique thing about small businesses in general, small real estate, the small barbershop, the small restaurant. Who wants? All right, this is a little bit of a diatribe or a little side. McDonald's is great, right? All those franchise restaurants. We have a place in our society for franchise, big, huge corporations. But how many people do I know who said, well, I want to go out somewhere special this Friday evening and I want to go out to McDonald's? Well, it's no, you want to go to the local shop, the restaurant where you know the owner and they work hard and they treat it well and it's their own place. It's like that cafe that you and I went to in Atlanta. This cool little local joint, right? That's the businesses that we as customers resonate with. And it's the same way in real estate. Who wants to have a hedge fund who owns 10,000 units be your landlord? Not me.
Mm-hmm.
That's a nightmare. Maybe they have some efficiencies and maybe all that, but what tenants really want is a quality landlord like us who cares about them, who cares about the property, who, yes, we're making a profit. There's nothing wrong with that. But we also use those profits to treat our tenants well. I kind of get on a pedestal here about this because I find it has so many benefits to your community, to yourself, and it's satisfying. Being a craftsperson is really, you never get there. You're always getting better the rest of your life. And this little side business craft you have happens to also make you money. That's a really cool long-term hobby.
And I'm with you, man. I want to be a time billionaire, not a money billionaire. There is a certain level of money that will make sure I'm satisfied and I feel safe and secure, and it will allow me to do some of the things that I really want to do with my time. But at the end of the day, I would probably trade 40 hours of my week back for way less money. And I think that's really important. And even I remember you on one of your episodes talking about Benjamin Franklin too. Yeah. I don't know if you remember that, but
absolutely. He's he's in my background up there at the my
I see him.
He's probably my favorite old American story because he was an entrepreneur. He moved from Boston and his he had 12 kids in his family, and he's all the parents were hey, you're on your own, go do your own thing. And he moved down to Philadelphia. I actually started in Boston, learning the printing trade. And then his brother was like kind of a, hard driving, boss. So he moved to Philadelphia, it was very entrepreneurial, started in the printing trade, bought some real estate over the years, by the way, as well. And by the time he was 40, in his early 40s, he was financially independent. He sold his business to his like main foreman, and owner financed it to him. And he got a stipend for the rest of his life, maybe 30 more, 40 more years. But he also had income from real estate. He was the postmaster general. So Benjamin Franklin used financial independence in his 40s in colonial America. And if he had not become financially independent, he wouldn't have done all his science experiments like discovering electricity. He wouldn't have helped found the United States and helped form the Declaration of Independence. He wouldn't have been able to negotiate the treaty that basically brought France into the Revolutionary War, that basically was to turn the tide of the Revolutionary War. Like it blew my mind. Like all of that followed from his being able to be self-starter, financially independent. And so for people today who are trying to be financially independent, I think it's one of the best examples of what you can do with your freedom is you can follow your interest, you can follow your curiosity, you can follow your service to your community. Like how cool is that? It's kind of the story, people talk about George Washington and all the other people. Like Ben Franklin was the one who I think was the most impressive.
That's sick. Love that story. Chad, I got one final question for you, but before I ask that, where can people connect with you and learn more about real estate if they're interested in kind of deep diving into your world?
Well, thank you for asking. If people listen to podcasts already, I have a podcast every week called Real Estate Investing with Coach Carson. So if you look on Spotify, if you look on Apple Podcasts, I'm on there. You can search for Coach Carson. That usually pops up. I also do a lot on YouTube. So I have a video podcast and I have video episodes. So if you like visuals and me drawing on a whiteboard and running the numbers, I have a lot of videos that people have really received well on YouTube. So check that out. And then if you're more in the written form, I have a weekly newsletter that you can go to coachcarson.com/newsletter. And I would love to connect with you there. I share behind the scenes ideas and stories on my newsletter every week. And then you can also just reply to me and say hello on the email as well.
Yeah, I love what you're creating over on your YouTube channel. I'm glad you also put the video on Spotify too, because you do get into some whiteboarding and it's nice that Spotify's got that video feature out there. I'll grab a URL from you, maybe the Buy Box YouTube video. We'll put one or two of those in the show notes if you're looking for an entry point into Chad's YouTube channel.
Great, thank you.
Chad, final question for you. If you had the opportunity to teach a 16-week class to a group of graduating college seniors on a topic that isn't normally covered in the classroom, what would you teach and how would you teach it?
I love this question. I initially thought, can I talk about money or finance? But I actually came down to, I would teach something related to how do you turn your goals into like a daily activity? Basically it's a time management and a project management skill that I think I would teach, because I find it's like, real estate investing is a skill and there's a group of skills. Financial independence is a group of skills, but there's this kind of foundational skill, like it's a stack of skills. And the one that I find people lacking a lot right now is you've gone to a job and people have sort of told you what your job was. And they're like, here's your task, go do it for the week. But if you want to be an entrepreneur and you want to be financially independent, and you want to do these projects on your own, you've basically got to create your own reality. You've got to set a goal and you've got to work it backwards. And you'll appreciate the running metaphor. I like to teach it as if you're going to run an ultra marathon, you can't just say, I'm just going to go run the marathon. You have to look at the next telephone pole and say what's the next telephone pole, and then the next telephone pole, and then the next, you have to have these you have to break that big goal into pieces. And so I think that skill is really, it sounds simple, but it can be pretty tricky. Like, all right, I want to make $10,000 a month in income, and I have $50,000 saved up. Like, all right, where do I go? There's a huge gap between those two things. So if you can figure out how to break that down into pieces, and then what I like to have is I have this little physical planner, and then every week I do this 15-minute planning session for the week. Every night before I go to bed, I do little 2 or 3 minute, what are the top 3 things I'm going to do tomorrow? What actions am I going to take? They're going to move me a little bit closer, almost like lining dominoes up. And then on a weekly basis, I say the same thing. What are the top 3 things in my real estate business that I can do that can move me a little bit closer towards that big picture goal? And then on a quarterly basis, say, all right, this quarter, my world works in quarters. What are the top 3 things or 5 things that I want to accomplish in this part of my life that can move me closer to that big picture vision that I have? And I found that so helpful when I used to play football in college, when I did my business, when I do real estate. That one skill is sort of the building blocks for building everything else, And so I would teach that, and I would actually help them implement it. We would do it in class. We'd have the actions. We would, what do you want to do? What goal do you have? Let's break it down. Let's turn into, and then by the end of the class, they would be doing that for the last 8 weeks.
That's cool. That'd be an awesome class too. I think that'd be a lot of fun and just so practical, which, man, I do wish just in general, college and education was a little bit more practical. And that seems like an obvious one that's out there.
Yeah, I agree.
Once again, folks, this is Coach Chad Carson. You can find him at Real Estate Investing with Coach Carson on podcast players and on YouTube. Chad, man, this was a blast. Thanks so much for sharing so much time with me.
This is so much fun. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the episode. As always, I appreciate your kind words. If you want to leave us a rating and review on your podcast player right now, that would absolutely make my day. If you want to find episode show notes, our blog, and other great resources, head over to tsirpodcast.com. If you have follow-up questions, an idea for a future episode, or just want to say hi, we have a contact form on our website, and those messages go straight into my inbox, and I promise you, I will reply. But all right, guys, I really appreciate you tuning in. I love you all, and you're not alone. Let's keep making it through our struggles together.